and I am a member of the steering committee of Bloomington United. I'm also the rabbi of Congregation Beth Shalom, and I'm sort of facilitating this meeting tonight. We're set up kind of formally with microphones and rows, but this is really meant to be a town meeting where we get to talk to one another and dialogue about issues that are important. I will say that the microphones here are very important. We're being taped, and so when the time comes for community discussion, I will ask that you find a microphone to speak from so that you'll get taped as well. Just a sense of what you can expect this evening. I'll have a few brief words of introduction, and then I'll turn the program over to our panelists, who will each make a short presentation. After their presentations, we'll have, I hope, about 45 minutes for general community discussion. Then I'm pleased to say that the Reverend C.J. Hawking, who's also standing outside holding a sign telling everyone where to go, was kind enough to bake cookies for us. So please stay after the formal program ends. We can talk a little bit. These gatherings of Bloomington United are often great places to meet people with similar concerns and interests and network a little bit. So please stay for cookies. We need to be out of the room by about 8:45 to help the library close up. So that's what you can expect this evening. According to my count, this is the 4th town meeting that Bloomington United has sponsored in recent years. Bloomington United is a coalition of diverse community members that emerged in the summer of 1998 to respond to some acute hate activity in Bloomington. Since then, we've tried to respond quickly and responsibly to other acts of hate, and most recently, Bloomington United led the Every Minute Count effort in response to a very hateful message that people were bringing into People's Park from outside our community. So that's primarily what Bloomington United is known for, and you might have seen lawn signs sprout up around Bloomington at critical times. But in between those crises, we try to have meetings such as this one, gatherings where concerned citizens can talk together about issues of diversity. So in the past, we've had a forum on hate crimes. We've had one on issues of special interest to the Black community in Bloomington, and we also had one on issues concerning the Latino community. And tonight, our topic will help us touch on issues of special relevance to religious minorities. I'll share with you Bloomington United's mission. Bloomington United is a coalition of community members whose mission is to promote educational opportunities that affirm the value of all human beings, bridge the differences between people, and respond to hate activity in our community. There are several sign-in sheets being distributed now. When they come to you, please give me your name and your email. There's a possibility that interesting information might emerge from tonight's meeting, and so if I have your email, I'll try to share it with everybody. Also, Bloomington United does keep a distribution list so that when there are future activities, if you are on the email list, you'll be sure to find out about them. Also, I'm happy to say that with the help of the Safe and Civil City program, a new and improved Bloomington United website is now coming soon, and so you can soon check on the web for more information about Bloomington United. And also, we have some resources about tonight's topic to share, so at the end of the meeting we'll put those out for you as well. That's Bloomington United. Now, our meeting tonight, we called, this is an hour-and-a-half meeting with a very long title, Religion, Public Life, and Civic Values, Living with Diversity in a Democracy. Our gathering was specifically timed to come at a time when so many of our neighbors are preparing for the Christmas holiday at home, in church, and also in their public spaces. in our public spaces. And actually driving here just tonight, I was hearing on the local news that today students in the Monroe County schools were working on ornaments for the downtown Christmas tree. So the topic that we're discussing tonight is very relevant and very real, and something that many of us are concerned about. To what degree is it appropriate to bring such observances into public spaces, and in particular into our public schools? What is the experience of those who do not celebrate Christmas at this time of year? And how can we as a community best honor the religious diversity, including those who are not religious at all, of our citizens and our students? These are some of the questions that I've asked our panelists to address and that we'll be discussing together shortly. I'd like to thank all those organizations that are co-sponsors of tonight's event. So thanks for your support and also for your help with publicity. Co-sponsors include the Bloomington Human Rights Commission, the Bloomington Safe and Civil City Program, the Center for University Ministry, Parents, Family, and Friends of Lesbians and Gays, that's the Bloomington chapter, the Progressive Faculty Coalition, the American Association of University Professors, the Social Justice Coordinating Committee of the Unitarian Universalist Church, and the Bloomington chapter of the ACLU, the American Civil Liberty Union. Thanks, all of you, for your help. Speaking first tonight will be Jeff Isaac, who is a professor of political science at Indiana University. After his comments, Annette Briggs will offer a perspective rooted in her own theological commitment. This is Annette, and she is pastor of University Baptist Church. And then Sarah Franklin will offer a perspective from the ground, speaking about how issues of church and state are put into practice in the context of a public school. Sarah Franklin is principal of Bloomington High School North. So I won't interrupt again until they're all three of them finished talking. Again, thank you all for being here, and thank you, panelists. So, Jeff.
Thank you, Mira. My comments will be brief. I would like to start by telling a story about Bloomington United, and then tell a story about something that has to do neither with Bloomington nor being united, and then go from there and just make a couple of points about the topic of what I'll simply call civic values in a democratic society. Many people in the community are aware of Bloomington United's existence because of the sign campaign that we organized first in the summer of 1998 in response to the distribution of hate literature in our community, and we organized these very aesthetically powerful signs, white cardboard with black lettering, and it said on the front of the sign, no hate speech, not in our yards, not in our town, not anywhere. Shortly thereafter, the people involved in that effort found themselves, at least some of them, me, found myself often having interesting conversations with people at Indiana University and elsewhere about what we mean when we say no hate speech. Are we trying to abolish certain forms of speech? Are we calling for the banning of certain kinds of speech? And that can't be good. We have a First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, and we believe in freedom of expression in this democracy of ours. We tried to clarify this. In fact, our second sign eliminated the phrase no hate speech. But I guess the point I want to make about this very poorly told story is that when we said no hate speech on our sign, those of us who put the sign together, what we meant to say was not certain kinds of speech ought to be prohibited by the government, but rather certain kinds of speech are unacceptable in our community, that we, as citizens of the community, are articulating a moral voice, that we're standing for certain values, that the promotion of bigotry and hatred in our community is wrong, not because we regard it as illegal to promote bigotry and hatred, but because we think it is morally wrong and detrimental to the values of our community. And that while we recognize the constitutional right of people to say vile things, We stand for something else, the values of pluralism, civility, and equal respect. And when people say vile things, we will say positive, constructive things, hopefully in a louder and more constructive and more civil way. Today I want to talk a little bit about what I'll call the ethics of citizenship. Now, the ethics of citizenship is a topic that's closely linked to questions of constitutional law. And in this conversation, I'm sure we're going to quickly move to certain discussions about what kinds of things are appropriate or inappropriate in a public school according to interpretations of the First Amendment. And these are important questions. There are legal questions at stake here that are adjudicated in the courts and that are discussed by lawyers. It's important for us to be aware of them, and as citizens, it's important for us to engage them. I want to talk briefly about a different set of questions which are related but not the same, that have to do not with the topic of what the law permits or does not permit, but the topic of what I'll simply call the civic values of a democratic society might be understood to permit or not permit. I want to talk a little bit about the topic of civility. And now I'm going to tell my second story. Briefly, I'm reading from a BBC Newswire from the 8th of May of this year, and it's about violence in Gujarat, which is an area in India. It's a state in India. This is what BBC reported. Mobs of Hindus and Muslims set upon each other overnight in several areas. The army was called in after police failed to disperse the crowds, which were armed with pistols, iron rods, stones, homemade explosive devices, and acid bombs. The latest clashes brought the number of dead to at least 23 since Sunday. This was Wednesday, so within 3 days. Some of the violence was reported to have been in retaliation for the death on Tuesday of a Muslim teacher who was burnt alive after being dragged off his scooter on his way to work. More than 900 people, mainly Muslims, have been killed since late February when Hindu mobs went on the rampage to avenge an attack on a train carrying Hindu activists from the disputed holy site at Ayodhya. I'm almost done. Right-wing Hindu organizations say the violence represented a spontaneous retaliation for the train attack, which left 58 Hindus dead. But human rights groups and foreign observers have alleged the wholesale complicity of state authorities in what they say was a systematic campaign targeting the Muslim majority. Rights groups also say that at least 2,000 have died, and many more have been forced to remain in refugee camps in Gujarat, unable to go back to their homes. That is taking place pretty much today in India. And there are many other parts of the world where similar things are going on. A couple of weeks ago, there was a similar kind of episode in Nigeria that was widely reported. These kinds of things that are going on in other parts of the world now were going on in Europe in the 16th century as a result of the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation. The 16th century is one of the bloodiest centuries in the history of Europe and had a profound effect upon European civilization and also upon our culture, which was forged in part as a result to escape some of the nastiness and brutality of the religious wars of the 16th century. So I want to talk a little bit about the idea of religious toleration and the idea of pluralism that is associated with it, and be very brief, turn it over to the other panelists, and hopefully we can then talk further. The idea of religious toleration emerges in response to these types of things in Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries. And it emerges as what we might call a rational response to religious persecution and violence. What emerges is a new idea of religious liberty, the idea that people ought to be free to practice religions of their choice, and they ought not to be encumbered by the state or by practitioners of other religions. The idea is that the state should remove itself from religious devotion and religious practice as a way of assuring to individuals a maximum amount of freedom for them to believe as they believe and to practice the religion of their choice without fear of coercion, without fear of persecution. The idea of religious liberty initially serves a protective function. The whole idea of separation of church and state was designed in the first instance to make it possible for people to practice the religion of their choice without fear. This involved, to some extent, the domestication, what we might call the domestication of religious enthusiasm, in two senses. Domestication in the sense of taming, and domestication also in the sense of privatizing. what is going on is a new conception of religious practice, but I think what needs to be understood about this is that its purpose is to make religious freedom possible. The purpose is not to drive religion from society, but in fact to create spaces of freedom where religious practice is protected by the state, and where the state is not used as an instrument for religious minorities to persecute majorities to persecute religious minorities. This is a very important idea, which was the foundation of the modern constitutional state, which was the foundation of the American Revolution and the foundation of the U.S. Constitution. The development of this idea of religious liberty was associated with a new political vocabulary that was largely secularized. It's not that people were no longer interested in God or no longer talked about God or the Bible, but they increasingly complemented this language with a new language, a language about universal human rights and a language about the secular interest that human beings share as people who take an interest in themselves and who take an interest in their worldly advancement and their property and their families. A new idea of individual privacy. And the concept of religious liberty is closely associated with a more robust conception of individual privacy, which assumes increasing prominence in the early modern period. Associated with this is the idea of what a couple of historians have called the godless constitution. The idea that the function of a constitution is not to enforce any religious orthodoxy, but to protect a series of basic rights which allow individuals the freedom to practice whatever religion they choose. The idea of a godless constitution does not mean a godless society. It means, in fact, that religion is free to flourish in society as individuals choose to practice religion. A very important idea. Now, this is the next idea that I want to talk briefly about is the really important thing from the vantage point of this panel. Associated with this new idea of religious liberty and the idea of a godless constitution is a new language of the common good. The idea that individuals, as citizens, all individuals, are holders of rights and bearers of responsibilities. That individuals are primarily responsible for themselves, that all individuals have a primary interest in their own freedom, and because each of us wishes to live our life in accordance with our own deeply held values and our own personal plans, we agree to join together on the basis of mutual respect. The idea here sometimes is called the social contract. The social contract assumes that difference between individuals is ineliminable. It cannot be eliminated. And that individual differences are valuable and ought to be respected by the law within certain broad limits, and that within those limits, individual citizens ought to be respectful of one another. Now, this idea of the social contract, the idea that individuals ought to be respectful of the values of others, even when they do not hold those values, is not natural. It is not easy. It does not come easy. It's very hard. It's the product of a historical learning experience. In order for people to behave in this way, they have to work very hard at it. One of the motivations for doing this work is the experience of what happens when this fails. What happens is people get very nasty with each other and people begin to feel very vulnerable and threatened. The social contract requires us to treat others, even when they are very different from us, and even when they subscribe to very different beliefs than our own, with a basic respect. And it also requires us to treat our own deep commitments as good for us, and perhaps even as ultimately good for everyone, but at the same time as our commitments and not as universal commitments. It requires us to understand that what we hold most dear is not necessarily what others hold most dear. It also requires us to acknowledge our own partiality and fallibility. We are not gods, and because none of us is God, we must be wary of condemning others or looking askance at the ways in which they are different, or the ways in which they think differently, or the ways in which they behave differently. An acceptance of difference is very, very central to the ongoing functioning of this kind of a social contract, and it makes very strong demands on people. It requires a great deal of self-restraint and moral self-discipline. It's very easy to imagine that what you think or what you believe or what you worship is clearly what everyone else ought to think or believe or worship, and that if they don't believe it, there's something wrong with them and they need to be somehow brought into line. It's very easy to believe that. It's also very damaging to the kind of society that we have. Now, this idea that there needs to be a respect for others who think differently, who behave differently, and who are different is true in general, and it's especially true with regard to religion, which is perhaps the most deeply held and ultimate commitment for most of us, because of the depth with which it is held and because of the extent to which it's linked to certain ideas of transcendent authority. It's particularly difficult to live religiously and to practice religiously in an authentic way that also allows one to be accepting of others who are different. But it's indispensable. Now, this kind of awareness that I'm talking about, this ethic of respect, this ethic of civility, is not inconsistent with public displays or expressions of religious values or symbols, nor is it inconsistent with a desire to act politically to advance religiously based moral values. In fact, most of the progress that's been achieved in our country in the past 200 years has been motivated in large part, not exclusively, but in large part by people who were grounded in religious traditions. It's not inconsistent with what I'm talking about to act on the basis of one's deepest moral values, even when these are religiously based, but it is inconsistent with the effort to institutionalize any particular religious creed or to justify values or policies simply on the basis of their religious foundation or mandate. It is perfectly appropriate for individuals to support and even to justify political positions because of their beliefs about what the Bible or another religious text or sensibility requires. But it is not appropriate for citizens in a democratic society to press political positions solely on the basis of the religious sanction, for this presumes what is not the case and what the democratic value of civic pluralism refuses to presume. What it presumes is that other citizens share or must share the same religious values as we subscribe to, and that those who believe other than what we believe by this very fact prove themselves not worthy of dignity, respect, or political recognition. If we're going to have civic pluralism, we cannot presume that others share or must share our values, and that if they don't, there's something wrong with them. I just want to say a couple of other things. I have some more planned, but I think I'm just going to can it. The key point here is that it has to do with what we presume, and the way in which what we presume affects the way we treat others in the public sphere and how we talk with others and how we talk to others and how we talk about others. The point is not that drawing upon a religious tradition or religious text is suspicious, but the point is that only making reference to what we think is our truth is really a sign of civic disrespect. It's not illegal. Nor do I want to say like it's the most immoral thing that you could do. On the scheme of things, you know, given what's going on in other parts of the world, the kinds of letters that we read in the HT every day, which say like, the school corporation ought to do this because it says this in Jeremiah 4, or we ought to have this public policy because Thessalonians says Y. Okay? I'm not saying that these are like profoundly immoral statements. And they're certainly not illegal or unconstitutional statements. But they're contrary to the ethos of civic pluralism, which is central to a democratic society. Not because they articulate sincere and deeply held religious convictions, because they do so in a way that is necessarily alienating to and offensive to, and in fact fails to resonate with other people who think differently. It makes a presumption. It makes the presumption that that text speaks the same way to everybody, and that's everybody's text, and pointing to that text is a sufficient basis for us to live together and for us to govern ourselves together. That presumption is, I think, what we need to be wary of and what we need to be constantly thinking about, talking about, and I think working against. The public schools are, I think, one very important domain in a democratic society for doing this kind of civic education, for constantly alerting us to the danger of that presumption. Thank you.
I
I have been hanging out with African people for the last few months, and what I've learned is that you don't begin your talk until you have greeted everyone in the room and described your appreciation for them. I will limit that to say that Rabbi Mira is my neighbor, my colleague, and my good friend. Dr. Franklin has been a big help to me as I have worked with some of these Africans in the last few months. And I read Dr. Isaac in the newspaper, and before I went back to Weight Watchers, I used to see him every day at Howie's Bagels. But I want all of them to know I'm honored to share this time and this topic with them. In particular, I'm interested in the question, how can we as a community best honor the religious diversity of our citizens and students, and in particular, in a public school forum? I want to speak to this question in three ways: as a Christian, as a Baptist, and as a citizen. Christianity is my fundamental worldview. An ongoing interplay between God and humanity is my basic assumption in all things. In this interplay, God is always courting human beings, and it is a seduction, of course, of sorts. God loves humans, and God wants to be loved by humans. Humans do not initiate in this interplay. Humans only respond. Humans choose to accept God's love. They choose to love God back or not. And as I watch and listen and read the ministry of Jesus, what is apparent to me is that every person chooses freely without coercion. In Christian theology, this is called the priesthood of the believer. The priesthood of the believer means that every human possesses, as part of his DNA or her DNA, the God-given right to respond to God freely, out of his or her own sense of God's call upon his or her life, her conscience, and her will. That means that every human being is in a constant experience of considering how we are going to respond to God. And my basic Christian worldview is that we have the God-given right to make these choices without the coercion of others, particularly those in authority over us, be they kings, presidents, priests, preachers, or second-grade teachers. I am also a Baptist. I may be the first Baptist to ever speak at a program sponsored by the list that Mira read. In those 1600s that Jeff described, my Baptist ancestors, men and women, were among those jailed, executed, and chased out of some of the nicest cities in Europe for refusing to participate in or conform to state-sponsored religion. Baptists were among those he described that changed Western culture into what he described. Those Baptists also got into trouble with religious folks because they refused to sign their creeds, believing that Jesus was the only standard by which they could be judged as faithful. They were a stubborn bunch, and many of them were burned at the stake being stubborn. And while my fundamental citizenship is in the kingdom of heaven, I am also an American citizen. And one of the tasks that American citizens have assumed for ourselves is public education. As a people, we have determined that every child shall have free access to the best education our property taxes and our bake sales can buy. And so it is within that publicly funded classroom that my Christian faith, my Baptist identity, and my civic responsibility coalesce. In the realm of civility, children are the least equipped to protect their own freedoms, and in their public school classroom, they should not have to. Unfortunately, that is not the case, and that is particularly not the case at Christmas time. Right now, kindergartners are learning to spell reindeer. Third graders are shopping for the voluntary $3 Secret Santa gift exchange. Fifth graders are building gingerbread houses, and high schoolers are learning the four-part harmony of God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen. I am unconvinced by the suggestion that these are unreligious activities. They are rooted in the stories and the traditions that surround the birth of Jesus. And if my children, who are Baptist preachers' kids who cut their teeth on our wooden nativity set, cannot separate these as religious and non-religious, how is a Hindu or a Jewish child going to separate them? Does an 8-year-old realize that her teacher is no longer teaching when she explains that the holiday gift exchange is voluntary? I don't think so. Is that same 8-year-old going to realize that suddenly she is not being evaluated for class participation when she chooses not to participate in the gift exchange? However well-intentioned the teachers are, and I know they are, I think a backhanded sort of coercion is at work when public school students experience even the slightest pressure to participate in religious activity they have not chosen. The Christian and the Baptist in me believe that their God-given right to come freely to faith, or not, has been violated. The citizen in me believes we have failed in our promise made toward fellow citizens called public school children. Which brings up the brass tacks, or where the rubber hits the road. We Baptists like to talk of the extreme separation of church and state. You'll know the difference between the extreme separation Baptists and the not extreme by whether or not they have an American flag in their sanctuary. In this case, that would mean that preachers preach and teachers teach. The study of religion as a component of culture has its rightful place in a public school classroom. Connie Austin is a Tri-North teacher who does a beautiful curriculum every October and does a field trip with that. That is appropriate, I do believe. Parochial schools abound. Bloomington has good ones for parents who want their children to be involved in Bible-based curriculum. But in public school, surely there are enough ways to study math without counting Christmas trees and candy canes, and I suspect there are other songs to sing. It can be done. I have seen it done. And every single time it's done, it is the children and all of the children who are winners. Thank you.
I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you this evening about Bloomington High School North and what's happening in the other schools. I think we fundamentally believe that schools are a safe place for students to learn, and we work very hard to make sure that that environment is maintained regardless of the beliefs that come through our door. It's louder. We talk about civic responsibility, and that's something that we look to our teachers to provide and to guide, and something that we address on a daily basis. But we also have to look to a balance in all the things that we talk about. We bring a wealth of information from our students. Information then can help students grow and learn and share and expand their horizons and be supported in those discussions. We keep emphasizing that we want a safe, civil, and positive learning environment. And in those discussions, when students bring their passion about a variety of issues, it's up to the teachers to be able to work with those issues, talk with the students, educate at all times, and help students appreciate the many different factors that are brought into the classroom, and to teach respect, not just tolerance, but teach ways of collaborating with others in the school, classroom, and in the community to grow as civically minded and responsible individuals. With 1,400 students, I am fortunate enough to have lots of teachable moments. And at Bloomington North, we've had our share of situations where we will question and talk about different issues that are presented to us. But the bottom line, and as the other panelists have pointed out this evening, is that we respect each other and each other's right to feel and believe the way they choose. And when it comes to school, that coming into the building means that we have an opportunity to discuss those issues in positive ways. We can't control what's happening out in the world. We can't control all the things that are said in the community, the protests, the arguments. What we can control is what happens in our building. And we continually emphasize to stop, talk to each other, listen to each other, and grow with the information. This isn't a place to judge. It's not a place to criticize, but it is a place to learn, it is a place to grow, and it is a place to question when there is confusion or misunderstanding, regardless of religion, race, any issue that comes into the school. We go through with students, they have deeply held passions, not so much values, but passions. And to funnel that into positive energy and positive ways of approaching things, it takes a lot of support from teachers. And we've tried to find ways of channeling those passions, whether it's working together to build a house, whether it's working together to develop a program that's inclusive of all individuals in the building, whether it's a student forum where we talk about how to make the school a better place. We channel those energies because fundamentally we're not looking at differences and ways of excluding people. We're looking at ways of including people and making sure that within the building everyone feels welcome and safe. We've had lots of experiences at North where things have crossed the line, and we've always wanted to have lots of discussions about those various issues, but we emphasize repeatedly in a school where we emphasize civility, concern, and care for others. Communication is the most important factor, and regardless of the disagreements, bringing those disagreements to the table and talking through those issues is the best way for all of us to grow in this community. Thank you.
I want to thank all three of you for being here, for bringing your expertise here, and for staying here now. What's going to happen now is a community discussion. And so if you have something to say, please come up, find a microphone. You might want to share a comment, a question for one of our panelists, or a question for the gathering at large. Jenny, please.
Hi, my name's Jennifer Bass, and I'm a concerned citizen and a parent, and I appreciate. They're just for
They're for the videotape and not for us. So if you're having trouble hearing, just let everybody know.
Okay, I can speak loudly. I appreciate everything that you all have said tonight, and my experience has mostly been in the school in this past semester, actually. I feel like in the school system, I've just become very aware of the majority rule mentality of the leadership in my children's school. And I've never been quite so aware of it before. Maybe it's never been so dominated by white Christian children as it is at South High School. And I think that the smaller the minority, the easier it is for the teachers to not really understand that there are other children. I don't think anyone does anything deliberately, but there have been 3 or 4 actual situations that I can report this last year. And we've made lots of waves, and you know, it's hard when you're a few parents making a lot of waves. But my question is for you, how do we get the leadership in the schools to help the teachers understand what this is all about? Because the teachers are coming from our own community. They've been educated the same way in a very homogeneous situation. And I don't blame anyone. No one does anything deliberately to hurt any other children. But I've seen it several times this year. And I'm just wondering, what can we do to have the leadership do some diversity training with our teachers?
I think you should say something else. Yeah.
I think the kinds of things we need to look at, and as I said, I'm an educator first, and that's whether it's working with teachers or students. And I think it's very important that we address these issues very directly. As a teacher, we need to remind the faculty that we finished celebrating Ramadan, Hanukkah, we have Kwanzaa, and it's a matter of educating everyone involved in the school that all these different things are going on. When the choir teacher talks about, I'm going to sing Christmas carols, well, that's fine, but what else are you going to add to the program to make sure that it's a balanced program and that all students and cultures are represented in the presentation? But we need to do it in such a way that it is not, we don't immediately get resistance. I don't want to stand up in front of a faculty and say, we're going to have diversity training now, because the wall goes up and it makes it very difficult to really get to the place that we need to be as a faculty and as a school community. So it's a matter of education on a daily basis, from little things to students working with faculty members, students making presentations at faculty meetings, and really bringing it home to understand what does it feel like for a student to go to school when X is happening. And that cuts even across Veterans Day celebrations. You know, having maybe 30 different countries represented, how do those students feel as we're doing an incredibly patriotic presentation? How do we make sure that things are inclusive and not exclusive? And it's a matter of ongoing education, not just for the students, but for everybody involved in the school community.
Can I respond to that too? One of the things, and I guess this is sort of where we would part company, because part of what I would suggest is, rather than try to do every single religious piece, do none of it. My husband is a IU professor. I don't know if you get this list, but he gets the list at the beginning of the school year of all the religious holidays. And he said, the first day of school should say no class for anyone, if I'm going to honor every single religious holiday. So he gives everybody one free Friday for a quiz, and he says, you know, the Jewish kids can take the Christian holiday if that's better for you, but, you know, this is how we have to handle it. It's stressful for me when we compare. I get frustrated because when we say, well, Christians have Christmas and Jewish people have Hanukkah, well, those are not comparable religious experiences for those two groups of students. And so I don't see how the Jewish kids don't feel slighted still on that. Easter is our greatest or our highest holy day, but it's not the best retail holiday, so we don't get 2 weeks, you know, then, and they don't put Easter on the front of the Lay's potato chip bag because nobody buys potato chips for Easter. We only buy those for Christmas. But the point being, the simpler solution for me, but I'm not a principal, is eliminate all of it, like they do at some schools. Our preschool, for example, eliminates all of it. It works beautifully. Now, where it's child-generated curriculum, when you talk about students' passions, that becomes another forum, I think, and another discussion, when children are bringing to the classroom, you know, their stories. But that would be the piece of that I would want included into that question.
If I could just speak briefly to it, I feel kind of like somewhere between the two of you on the question of to what extent should diversity be represented in school activities, and to what extent should certain kinds of differences be eliminated in the name of just a commonality. You know, should there be exemptions for every kind of possible experience or not? You know, I would just say two things about that. The first is that we need to distinguish between kind of common curricular issues and the way that teachers make exemptions for students. I make all kinds of exemptions for students if they're sick, if their grandmother dies, whatever. And it seems to me it's possible for any individual teacher to be maximally flexible and sensitive to a whole range of student concerns, including religion and lots of other things, and at the same time, you know, adhere to some sense of a common curriculum and certain common expectations. You know, the other thing that I want to say is that in addition to asking the question, how does diversity get represented in the school, which is a very important question. When do we represent it, and are we representing diversity in a truly diverse way? When is it best not to represent it? You know, is it appropriate to represent it by simply having a kind of additive approach? Well, if you do this, then you have to do this, 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 this. You know, the other question is what content and seriousness we give to the idea of a common culture. So that the question is not simply how we represent what distinguishes us from one another, but how we understand and construct what we have in common. you know, what does it mean to be an American citizen or to be a citizen? You know, what are the freedoms that we enjoy? How did we get them? How do different diverse people from a whole variety of experiences struggle with each other, against each other, to create a set of freedoms that we all enjoy and can appreciate? That's not a question of how we represent diversity, but a question of how we understand our commonality as citizens. And it seems to me that it's equally important to do that as it is to worry about the diversity question. The diversity question, in my experience in the public schools, generally comes up when you have this boundary crossing problem, like something that seems to cross the line of separation of church and state, or something that seems to offend someone is done. And then the question is, how do we manage that most effectively? It seems to me that, like, the nature of life is that there's constant crossing of boundaries, transgressions, offenses. And what we need to do is have a robust idea of civic education that teaches us how to deal with all of these things, so that what it means to be a citizen is not simply kind of like waving to a flag or saying yes or no to whatever the president says, you know, but that it has a richer meaning.
George von Furstenberg, if I may broaden the discussion in a certain way beyond public schools, because we have voucher programs that are increasingly found to meet constitutional challenges, and we have lots of institutions that are not exactly state, but they're directly or indirectly state-funded and nonetheless faith-based. These institutions are likely to be growing. The question is, in between the desire to communicate diversity and teach and train people in habitual use of mutual respect and so forth, there is the countervailing desire to have homogeneity, to protect a certain focus on a set of values. And so you have in New York City Yeshiva University, and you have Fordham University, and you have schools, and you have Catholic schools, and so on. And these particular institutions, of course, have something else in mind and can be seen in the mosaic of similar institutions to, in fact, represent a certain form of diversity. But I just want to submit that it is not easy to separate state from other social functions. The idea of, you know, simple-minded separation of church and state doesn't define state. Any major social function that is exercised in society, with or without direct government funding, has certain elements of shaping our collective social life, and that gives it a role that is akin to a public a polis, a public face, a public utterance, a public statement. So what I like particularly Jeff and Annette to address is the question, do you accept a vision of diversity that consists of mosaic stones that are quite homogeneous in their own training, in their experience? Does that somehow add up to a tapestry that you find agreeable, or what would you do to prevent the emergence of such an alternative model? Because the public school model is a monolithic model by its conception, and rightly so, perhaps, and I'm certainly not trying to make a point one way or the other, but just raise this. Thank you so much.
Your question is very profound, and I agree with the sentiment behind your question. And, you know, I offered an overly simplified account of the origins of the idea of religious liberty. We don't live in the 17th century anymore, and in all kinds of ways in the 21st century, we have interfaces between state and society, for good and ill, that enormously complicate the model of individual liberty, religious liberty, and otherwise that emerged in the early modern period. I believe, first of all, that I believe in associational freedom, but I think your question cuts deeper than, it's easy to say, well, these things, people are free to create Fordham University or Yeshiva University or yeshivas or, you know, religious institutions. The question is how they function in a democratic society. Certainly they ought to be tolerated and people ought to be free to form them. I think the real hard and interesting question has to do with the extent to which they're publicly subsidized, as they are. And I personally am not against the public subsidization of a whole range of civil society institutions, including faith-based institutions, okay? And in fact, I've done some work on the area of faith-based initiatives. I mean, this is you ask a complicated question. I don't want to kind of go too deeply into it. The really interesting discussions about faith-based initiatives, for example, that raise the general question, when is it appropriate for government to subsidize in some way or another a faith-based community kitchen or a faith-based employment center or rehabilitation center for drug addicts, et cetera. I mean, there are certain criteria that are taken seriously in the law, and that are also, by the way, even taken seriously in the charitable choice provisions of federal legislation that have to do with to what extent these institutions adhere to federal non-discrimination law. Do they require the recipients of the service that's being subsidized to, you know, to be a member of the religious institution that's providing the service? It seems to me that it is important to recognize that a whole range of institutions serve positive functions in a democracy. We need to have spaces of homogeneity, and they need to be not only valued but sometimes supported. But they only should be supported when they're consistent with certain basic democratic values. When they're not, I believe people should be free. If you want to have a, you know, if you want to have a social service agency, for example, that discriminates against, let's just say, the Boy Scouts may be a good example, you know, that discriminates against gay people, okay, on freedom of association grounds within certain parameters, you may be free to do that, but such institutions, in my opinion, ought not to be subsidized by a democratic state, which is in the business of maintaining certain basic principles of equality and mutual respect, in my opinion. So it seems to me there need to be certain lines that are drawn in certain parameters. There are certain basic values that need to govern how we think about these things.
Tony Campolo is a fairly well-known in Baptist circles Baptist preacher and a teacher at Eastern Baptist College, and he told a group of Baptist pastors in North Carolina last spring that we should be very wary of faith-based initiatives because it's like mixing manure and ice cream. It won't hurt the manure that much, but it'll ruin the ice cream. His point being, of course, that is probably a one-sided approach. Government is the winner because we, as the church, assume some of their liability and debt. Now, as a Christian who believes I ought to be serving the poor, serving the needy, it's a debt I ought to be carrying anyway, so I shouldn't need that initiative. I am very, very leery, probably more leery of faith-based initiatives just because I know where that can go and the abuse possible on the part of the church from that, the abuse of other people. I said something in my presentation that I'm now reconsidering, and that a case in point that I think you're referring to. I believe that public school is our country's best opportunity to be the kind of society that we want to be. A classroom, a public school classroom, is the labyrinth of American culture that we all imagine could be. But one of the things that's happening in families like my family, conservative Christian families, is that they are taking their children out of public school and either putting them in parochial school or homeschooling them. They have academic reasons for doing that and social reasons for doing that. Taken to its logical extreme, that ends up with what I think you're describing, a society where everybody is free as long as they hang out with people who believe exactly what they believe. Well, you know who ends up left there? It's the kids who are not being sort of cared for and raised by people who have any interest in how they grow up. And public school is those kids' best hope, I think. And so I think that, I don't know if I'm getting at what you're saying. I think that parochial schools and those kinds of things are everybody's free choice, but I think that carried to their logical extreme, they create a society that nobody really probably wants. And that is where we all retreat and live in our own little sort of hovel, you know, if it's a social hovel or a political hovel or a ethnic hovel, I don't know what kind of hovel it is, but, you know, we don't have to interact anymore. When I grew up in Bedford, 30 miles from here, I knew no Jewish people, and I knew one family of African Americans, and they had 3 boys, all brothers, and we all thought that we were the most racially open and diverse community we'd ever been in. That turned out actually not to be true. And, you know, my children are growing up in a much different arrangement and have the opportunities at 4 and 5 and 6 years old that I didn't have until I was out of seminary, until I was 25 and 26 years old, because of where they go to school and where they live. So I don't know if that touches that or not at all.
I go to South, and before that I went to Jackson Creek Middle School. And in all honesty, I really need to say that, I mean, not to demean your very intense efforts on combating these problems, but I don't think they're that big a problem in elementary school as some people make them out to be, or in middle school, and especially not in high school. First of all, no matter what you do to improve the diversity in school, kids are always going to encounter these obstacles in life, because you go out in the world outside of school and you see the department stores with the Christmas sales, and you see all the houses around you lit up with the Christmas lights. I'm not exactly sure why Jews don't maybe think about putting up blue and white lights for Hanukkah, but they don't. Anyway, you see Christianity all around you, and when you're a non-Christian, you can't escape from it. And America was founded as a Christian nation, and that's the way the Founding Fathers intended it to be. And although it's a nation of a lot of diversity, Christianity is such an integral part of our culture that there's really no getting around it. And instead of an effort to really improve religious and cultural diversity in school by the kind of additive approach that you've discussed, the best way to do it is to honestly incorporate intense cultural education into the history curriculums. And instead of teaching about the Islamic faith, for example, as a faith, instead, the Arab culture should be presented to students. And especially in this day and age where Arabs are getting a bad rap big time by the media, it's important for students to see the Arab empires of the past and see the glory that they once had, and that in many ways many of them still have. And the truth is that the majority of Arab countries are not terrorist countries, and the majority of Arabs and Islamists are not terrorists at all. And honestly, I don't know anybody that celebrates Kwanzaa. And I know many blacks, and they're all Christians, but there are people out there. I think instead of simply putting up Kwanzaa decorations everywhere, maybe the history classes should make an effort to show us what Kwanzaa is, because I'm not sure anybody knows what it is. I think that's important because I'm curious. I'd like to know.
Is that your question?
No, I see they have this thing that looks like a menorah that I see sometimes somehow connected to Kwanzaa. I'd like to know more about this. In any case, in conclusion, all I want to say is that it's important to kind of incorporate religious diversity into schools, but the planet is not going to explode if it isn't. And I am 16 years old, and I grew up without any Jewish influence in school, and I didn't die. I didn't kill myself. I'm Jewish, and I'm proud of it, and I know I'm Jewish. I don't care about anybody else and what they want me to be. I mean, school didn't have any effect on me there, and I mean, it didn't have any effect on most of these people. I mean, all of you, I'm sure, grew up in an environment where Christianity was the norm, especially in school, and if you weren't Christian, okay, you felt alienated sometimes, all right, then you grow up, you know who you are, and you're secure in that, and it's important to be secure in what you are. I mean, that's all I really have to say. Also, to address the question of gays in the Boy Scouts, I'd like to point out that straight men have a much bigger chance of molesting kids than gays do. Anyway, thank you.
What I hear you telling me is that I need to do my job as a Christian pastor. So that's a good word for me.
Dan, please, yeah.
I really want to address this to Dr. Isaacs. You're a bit about respect and allowing one another to be what we are without being violent to one another. I'm sure you read recently, probably sick of having read all the commentary about the recent report of the decline in the Jewish population of the country and the world. And many religions, well, especially Christianity and Islam, at least, are very much interested in converting the world to their perspective. So one part of the nature of religion, of deeply held values, is the spread of this. And even as Jews, we're concerned not so much with spreading, but at least with not shrinking any. How do you incorporate this idea of letting people be what they want to be, and yet including the fact that one of the things that they want to be is evangelists? That's a hard thing for me to come to terms with. I don't know what to say about that. I'd like to hear your perspective on that.
Well, Dan knows me as Jeff. I'll respond as Jeff, not Dr. Isaac, okay? I am Jewish. Dan knows that. That guy was my son. I'm concerned about all kinds of evangelism. You know, I guess as a Jew I'm concerned about evangelism, but I'm mainly concerned about just the evangelical impulse in many aspects of life. And I don't know that I personally am more revolted by certain ways in which Christians seek to evangelize Jews than I am by the ways in which certain kinds of political ideologues of the left or the right might seek to evangelize on behalf of their points of view. It is a fundamental paradox of, let's just say, the modern conception of freedom that that our society is constructed on the basis of. That on the one hand, we talk about these values of pluralism and respect, equal liberty, whatever. On the other hand, the freedom that people enjoy also gives them the freedom to evangelize. And the evangelical impulse is not inherently, it's not understood by its practitioners as oppressive at all. In fact, it's liberating. You know, there's a term that the theologian Stanley Hauerwas, he called killing with compassion. You know, it's like, you know, the evangelical impulse is like, please let me save you. You know, please let me save you. You know, I love you. Let me save you, please. You know, but I don't have a solution to that problem. It seems to me that there we have a tension between certain understandings of religious praxis, which are very important in the culture, and then other kinds of civic values, which, quite honestly, have some importance in the culture, but probably aren't as important as I wish they would be, and Bloomington United wishes they would be, and some other people in this room wish they would be. And what we need to do is to promote those values, but it doesn't seem to me there's any kind of shield that we can invoke to protect ourselves from the evangelical impulse. And it is true on some level that the freedom that particularly Christians in this country have, certain kinds of Christians, to imagine that people who don't share their religion are damned, and that only if they save us, you know, through various means, including coercive ones, can we not be damned. That impulse is like on a deep level, a deep cultural level, at odds with certain aspects of democratic citizenship. On the other hand, the desire to extirpate that, or ban that, or abolish that, or prohibit that is also profoundly inconsistent with the values of a democratic society. And so what we live with is a world, you know, again, I'm going to quote Adam Kent Isaac, a world that, you know, that presents us with all kinds of insecurity and vulnerability. There's no quick fix. There's nothing that we can draw upon to kind of guarantee us that we can be who we want to be or protect ourselves from others. We need to learn how to interact better with others. We need to develop thick skins, and at the same time develop a spirit of generosity that I think, you know, is in short supply. Wasn't that flowery? I'm not sure I said anything in response to your question, but yeah.
I'm glad to hear that you're as confused about it as
Oh yeah, I had to make a profession of it.
I want to invite people to respond to the comments that were from the floor as well as to the panelists. I mean, I'm still thinking about the various points that Adam made, and we'll talk about the blue and white lights later. But
I'm thinking how I didn't know that it was father and son until he spoke, and then I knew. I was like, of course they're related.
Are you insulting me?
Not at all. Not at all. But he and I are going to have a talk. It was wonderful.
Aren't you supposed to be watching your sister now?
A couple of reflections on the concept of evangelicalism, and
might be accused by some of you of being a practitioner myself. But I think if we look back to Abraham and Moses, you could say that when Moses was in front of Pharaoh, that he was being evangelical in his practice. And there is a very dynamic creative process in the major divine religions, which are coming in and grabbing hold of the existing thought process, the existing order, and putting some heavy muscle to it. Now the issue is whether we're going to kill ourselves over it, or do we say everybody puts the cards on the table and each person has a right to pick up which cards fit them.
That's a good one. As an evangelical, I would like at least one of the statements to be on the table, is that there are lots of kinds of evangelicals. And there are those, like myself, I hope, who attempt to practice that piece of our faith. And evangelism is a core piece of Christian life for me. But that it is possible to do that with respect, without violating the integrity of another person. And in the context of what I described as the priesthood of the believer. And it becomes my privilege to share faith back and forth. Together, you share, I share, but both of us walk away from that free and with our integrity intact. And so, you know, I don't want to take responsibility for people who don't do that, but I also don't want to deny that, you know, that I too am an evangelical of that.
If I could just, I honor what you're saying, and I also Dan's comment, who Dan just spoke, is also Dan Enslow, not Dan Price, also another profound Dan, is a very important comment. I mean, religion, even in its evangelical forms, is a very powerful thing, and you know, it has power to do great good as well as not, you know, and I do think that we need to learn and think more deeply about practices of respect and acceptance of difference, but I also think we need to learn about how to have a thicker skin, you know, and I'm not afraid of you. I mean, you know, in other words, be evangelical. That's okay. I can deal with that. You know, I could also deal with, you know, passion in public life is a very important thing. It's also the source of a lot of justice movements, you know, and sometimes it becomes like overwhelming, but you know, any love can be overwhelming, anything good can be overwhelming. We have to learn how to kind of manage it, but I don't think we should try to eliminate it. So there, all these very powerful forces in our society need to somehow be brought into some synergy which isn't destructive. Your way of being evangelical, it seems to me, perfectly hospitable with the pluralism of a democratic society. There are other ways of being evangelical which are, you know, which are not as hospitable, and they're also part of our world. We need to figure out ways of dealing with them. That's one of the reasons we have events like this.
Sure.
Other comments? This recently happened to me, and I'd love some responses. A parent that I know was telling me about their glee in visiting a classroom in December where, unlike all of the other elementary school classrooms and down the hallway, the theme of the decor in the classroom was under the sea. So there were seaweed sort of pasted everywhere and octopi hanging from the ceiling and little starfishes glimmering here and there. It was really impressive, they thought. But what made it truly impressive was that as you walk down the hallway, all of the other classrooms were red and green and had all kinds of seasonal things going on. And I told this to a few people, and I said, isn't that exciting that can happen, that there are teachers who are doing that? And they said, Jewish people said to me, doesn't that seem kind of wrong? Isn't it wrong not to acknowledge the season at all in any way? And it made me think, and Adam's comment makes me pause also, is this too much ado about maybe not such a big deal? But I'd love to hear from other people on this question.
Was completely based upon hatred of the sea.
Right, right.
I mean, they were
Yeah.
discriminating against me. They're trying to offend me with this ocean paraphernalia. And I'm terribly hurt by this. What am I going to do?
Does anyone else want to share some responses?
If you don't mind, 2 comments. Tomorrow is the annual Christmas dinner where I work. You pay $8.50 and they hire a caterer, and it's a wonderful affair. I personally won't be participating, but not because it's Christmas, mostly because the meal itself is a unique combination of sugar and trafe. But I'm not at all offended by that. I work in a building of, there's a couple hundred people that work there, and there are no other Jews that work in the building. In fact, at Olive Crane, I know of one other now. There were 2 until Susan moved away. But I don't feel the least bit put upon by that. Now, in part, it's because, as you said, we live in a society in which respect is pretty much the order of the day. If I were forced to work in a smaller cubicle than everybody else or something, that would probably be a different matter. But I like Adam, I don't find that to be problematic for me. Now, I understand that for a little kid, that's a different matter. And I'm not sure what to make of that exactly, except to say it's really up to the parents. I'd like to congratulate you for your parenting skills, by the way. You seem to have done a fine job. But I have a thick enough skin. In fact, not only does it not offend me, I almost feel kind of special. Being, one of the people who stands out, not like all the rest, everybody else there that just, attends this Baptist church or that Presbyterian church, and I don't attend any of them. I think that's a very different situation, and it doesn't make me feel isolated at all. It doesn't bother me, nor does putting up Christmas decorations or anything like that. I don't like the idea, in fact, of including every holiday in order to be able to include Christmas. That's partly because I don't want Jewish holidays to get scooped up along with Christmas and ruined the way Christmas has been by the commercial interests. But it's also because I don't think that you have to tell the children you can't celebrate Christmas without acknowledging that somebody celebrates Ramadan or Pesach or whatever. The Christians have their holidays, and they're welcome to celebrate them. And since most of the people around here are Christians, that's going to show up. When High Holy Days come along, we have to take our kids out of school and get their assignments for the day and so on, and that's a problem, and we live with it, and they learn to grow up that way and that they're a little different than everybody else. And I don't think that's a problem. As Adam said, that's a life lesson that they need to learn anyway. So I'm going to say go ahead and celebrate Christmas and put up, snow bells or whatever in the classroom, and maybe even have Santa Claus come visit, and that's okay. It doesn't really bother me.
I think Adam's point is well taken. If we look at it from a cultural perspective, then you can bring in lots of different things to the discussion. And when I was talking about recognizing other religions, when students are asked to be excused as allowed by state attendance laws, then there shouldn't be a criticism attached to that. Or why are you getting out of school? Students shouldn't have to defend those family decisions. So again, when I take a moment to educate and say, this holiday is happening as they do at IU. There's a website at IU, lists all the holidays, what does it mean, how will students be affected by that? Those are the same kinds of teaching things that we do in the schools. This holiday is coming up. Students may be asked to be excused. This is the reason why. And it's not a point of criticism or exclusion. It's a point of family choice and celebration in a particular way.
Other comments?
I think one of the problems with these kinds of discussions is that so often they're centered around how people feel. The reason why we should have religious pluralism is because some people feel offended if we don't. And I don't think that from the state's point of view that makes any sense. The state is not in the business of not offending people. The state is in the business of making sure that we have a society that functions. So I think, and especially with the anecdotes and things like that, well, I don't feel offended by it, so it should be okay, or whatever. Some other kids might feel offended by it, so we shouldn't do that. From a civil society standpoint, I don't think that's a very valuable or viable argument. I think it has to come down to what are the state's interests? And the state's interest is not to promote one religion over another. So if the reason why somebody wants something to happen is because it's based on some religious text, it's not in the state's interest to support that. If it's based on something having to do that will support the society overall, if it's based on a value that the state can use as a foundation, then that's the reason why we should do it. You know, and whether you're in the school or whether you're in the workplace or whatever, that all comes from the state. It all comes from law. You know, employers are not going to start having diverse events just because they feel like it. It's generally because of cultural trends that have happened, part of which has been the legal side of it. So I guess bottom line is to just try to clarify in these discussions, when you're talking about things that have to do with the state, get away from the personal and the sort of feeling side of it. That part of the discussion is valuable, but in terms of making decisions for the state, I don't see that as a viable argument.
Whenever someone says the state, I feel I must comment. It's my profession. I think I agree with you, particularly insofar as you're wary of having public discussions or making public policy on the basis of sentiments or the articulation of sensitivities or grievances or something along those lines. On the other hand, I don't know what the interests of the state are, and it depends in part on what kind of state we're talking about and how we define the state. And part of how we define the state depends on how we act to create or to sustain a kind of state. It seems to me a democratic state is based on the idea that there are certain fundamental rights. And if we push the question, where do those rights come from, we're going to start talking about how it is that people feel a sense of indignity or indignation, which derives from a sense of being offended. So it seems to me the question of offense should never be the center of discussion, and it's quite boring, you know, for people to just have these rap sessions where they talk about how badly their feelings are hurt, and couldn't we organize things in a way that no one's feelings will hurt. I completely agree with you, but I also think we need to be clear about what a democratic state is. And a democratic state is a state in which citizens are recognized as having a certain integrity and a certain dignity, and I don't think we can completely separate that from the question of offense, you know.
This is sort of in line with what you just said. I just wanted to say we all have a right to speak out. And it is so important if someone makes an offensive remark or gives a faulty comment, it is so important that we call them on it. You can do it politely, but nevertheless, you do not get a fallacious statement. You don't let it go out to other people because it will be believed. So when something is said that you feel is wrong, the time to correct it is then. Not take the person aside later, privately. You do it as much as you can within the group in which it was stated, and you correct them with it, and you just try to put things straight. And we're all individuals. We all have a right to say what we want, but we should be very considerate of the other person, and occasionally we have to set things straight.
Ruth and her husband Bob were founding members of Bloomington United. And, I mean, this whole thing is taking place in part because a small number of people, including them, did that with the first pamphlets that led to the formation of this group. I mean, they did that individually, but also with other people. Thank you, Ruth.
That's why I suggested that his description of evangelical was not entirely accurate, that he needed to sort of, right?
Who?
You.
I was responding to someone else's question, but whatever. Go on. You go on.
So
You're talking. I'm just listening.
But I keep feeling like these Bloomington United things, what we preach needs to happen inside the discussions that we're talking about. So you made some comments about evangelical, and I felt myself saying, oh, that's not entirely true, but then I thought I'll let it go, but then I thought, no, I can't let it go.
That's okay.
Because that's what we're doing here.
Don't let anything go. That's okay. But when you look at the tape, you'll see that I said some evangelicals.
Sure.
Those kinds of qualifications are the way that I talk. And so, I mean, and I'll stand corrected if I didn't. But if you took offense, I apologize, and I'm glad you're calling me on it now.
I have the
yeah,
thickest skin in the
yeah,
room.
that's okay.
But I want us
Obviously.
to be able to dialogue here. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, please.
I'm trying to think about how to make this comment without giving Adam more press. He's gotten so much attention for his comments here. But this is for Sarah, I think. I've been reflecting tonight on what it was like for me as a member of, as a child, in a small lumber town in Southern Oregon that was totally homogeneous, completely unlike any college town. Growing up, learning only about the point of view that reflected that community. And then when I was older, 12 or 13, moving to the San Francisco Bay Area and starting to go to school, which saved my soul because I had to encounter ethnicity, I had to encounter all sorts of diversities. I had to encounter the dirty speech that became free speech movement from Berkeley. I had to encounter the gay movement, the anti-war movement. I had to encounter all sorts of things that I had learned tacitly to be subversive and wrong and different. And while I think it's very important for us to think about the sensibilities of the minority members of our community, I think it's important for the majority members of the community to learn more about the diversity that is our world if we're going to have a pedagogy for democratic citizenship where we can encounter one another robustly, we can be agonistic short of antagonistic, and we can be respectful of one another. And so I guess this statement has kind of a tacit a suggestion and question about to you about what's at stake for the majority population of your student body to learn about these issues of diversity.
As you pointed out, I see it only as an advantage where the majority has that opportunity to share ideas, to talk openly in a safe environment, to see, hear, and appreciate the differences that are around us. As Jeff pointed out, a basis for doing that is the commonality. All students in this building are attending this school for the sole purpose of graduating from high school. That's what's out there. But on that path of reaching graduation, there will be lots of opportunities to gain new knowledge and get new information and share in different experiences that they might not have at some other place. When we look at our student population and the activism in our student body, you can't shy away from things. You are involved in some way, one way or another. It's in posters, it's in different meeting announcements, it's providing lots of opportunities to observe initially, probably, and hopefully participate in some way. But I only see that as an advantage with the student population and with a teaching staff who is supportive of those kind of conversations. We make mistakes. All of us do, and there have been times that we've had to step back and rethink an event or something that may have happened. But I think it's very important, as you pointed out, when we see something that's not right, we take the time to educate and make sure it doesn't happen again, and we use those opportunities to discuss issues. But again, it's a growing opportunity for everybody in that school.
I think we'll have just one more comment, and then our time is almost up. So.
My name is CJ Hawking. I'm a part of Bloomington United and felt compelled to follow on the gentleman's comment. I moved here almost 4 years ago to the date in the opposite direction you did. I moved from Chicago to what I came to learn as being the Bible Belt. And I didn't know that. I didn't know that Bloomington was a part of the Bible Belt, but indeed it is. I'm also a United Methodist pastor. And coming out of a context where it's very eclectic in Chicago, it's been very shocking to me to see ornaments being made in the schools, to see Secret Santas, and to hear about a choir, a public school choir singing Christmas carols. It boggles my mind. And because we are an educated, somewhat sophisticated community with the influence of the university, I wonder if Bloomington cannot elevate not only the discussion but the practice to be much more true to what a public school is designed to be, and it's not designed to be a church or a synagogue or any of those things. My daughter is 5 years old, and she's in a private kindergarten right now, and I'm just bracing myself for when she hits first grade and is inundated with Christian arrogance and dominance, because that's not at all how we intend to raise her. So it's very difficult for me to come into this environment, even though my faith dominates, and to somehow feel comfortable in what I perceive to be a very closed, exclusive, almost hostile environment to anyone who doesn't fall in this 96% majority range.
I have 3 children in public school in Monroe County, and so cumulatively we're in our 10th year. You know, we're in our 10th classroom. I have a 6th grader, a 2nd grader, and a kindergartner. And in the same school, I find this experience is brand new the next year. It has everything to do with what teacher is in that classroom. We will have one child in one classroom where there is nothing, nothing. It is not present, and then we'll have another child in that same year in that same school in a classroom where, the Santa Claus display, the Santa Claus collection is there. And the very first question that was asked is, what can we do as parents? And I don't know that we ever answered that, but I think what you do is go to the teacher and express your concerns. Now, as a Baptist pastor, I go and express these concerns, and they just stare at me with their mouth open, like, what are you talking about? We were going to have you come sing or something. But so it just depends on that. But it's very interesting because our school is populated by the families of IU professors, which would have made me think we would be the school to sort of elevate the discussion. And then I have 2 teachers in my church who are the music teachers in Greene County school system, and if they don't do Christian music, they hear about it from their parents. So it all depends on what school, what classroom you're at, I think. So, and I'm sympathetic to a principal's predicament because she's got parents coming in saying, why is the Santa Claus display up? And then the teacher is the next one in saying, why can't I have my Santa Claus display up? It's my classroom. So it's a predicament.
It seems to me, though, that the issue really isn't the managerial question of how to deal with those delicate situations, but really the question of what is the function of a public school. Mm-hmm. And, I think you articulated a very powerful understanding of that. It's not clear to me that that is the Monroe County School Corporation's understanding. It may be its understanding at the level of some mission statement somewhere in someone's drawer or something, but it's not clear that that's the understanding in terms of public policy, how the school corporation is run. You know, how every school principal understands his or her mission or vocation, you know, and it seems to me that there we need to work much harder to deal with the school corporation and to continually raise these issues. You know, and if anyone has ideas about this, by the way, you know, people in Bloomington United have talked about this for a couple of years, and we used to have a subcommittee trying to work on this, and in some small way, this event is the outcome both of that process and the failing of that process to come up with anything more substantial beyond a conversation like this, which is a wonderful conversation. If people do have ideas or desires to become involved in this, I think this is a really, really important question. You know, how do our schools understand their civic mission? And I'm going to be really quick because we're probably running out of time, but it seems to me this is partly a question of diversity issues, but it goes beyond that. You know, I just want to say, you know, my friend Bob Ivey, who asked the question before, spoke on the courthouse today, on the courthouse lawn, at a small demonstration about a potential war in Iraq. And, you know, it was a decent-sized crowd. I'm sure you'll see a paper about this on the cover of the HT tomorrow, and there was some media there. There weren't that many people there. We could have an interesting conversation about why there weren't more people there. Obviously, a lot of people don't share that point of view, but there was an effort to participate in a public discourse about whether our country is going to go to war. This is a really important thing. Today's International Human Rights Day in December. It doesn't have to do with Christmas, but arguably it's something of some significance. How many classes in this entire school corporation do you think had a discussion about International Human Rights Day, or should we go to war in Iraq, or if there's a demonstration on the square, what do you think about it? How many schools are going to talk about this? How many classrooms tomorrow? I'll bet like none, you know? There's too many other important things to talk about. There's something wrong with this.
I want to thank everybody for participating tonight. And I see someone who might want to say a quick word standing up. Is that right, John? A quick word.
Let me just say, first of all, I'm John Malloy. I'm superintendent of schools for MCCSC. And I appreciate the dialogue this evening, especially when public schools are always the topic. One thing in coming to Bloomington that somewhat disappointed me is the diversity of the community. I really thought with the university that the schools would be more representative of the community, and quite frankly, we're only about 17% when we talk about diversity. And so in some ways, our schools are reflective of the community and the culture in which we live. And unfortunately, in this community, because many individuals were born and raised here, and many of our teachers are in our schools, teaching from the standpoint of their experiences. And many schools around the country, not just in Bloomington, are extremely reflective of the teachers in those schools, and generally those teachers come from a close community, if not that community. I can say that the communities where I have worked have been very diverse, much more so than Bloomington. I've been in Pike Township in Indianapolis. We were roughly 45% minority. Michigan City was roughly 30%. And one thing that was very important in the schools where I operated is to have not just tolerance, but teaching acceptance. One of the things that we've done as of November 21st is we have kicked off what I call Human Understanding and Diversity Advisory Committee. It's made up of approximately 30 individuals, half of which from the MCCSC, who will be responsible for implementing curriculum and directing any kind of recommendations coming from the advisory committee. And the other half are from a broad base group in the community, of which the Bloomington United is represented. Also, Rabbi Wasserman is a member of that committee. And the idea is at least to give a charge to that committee to focus in 4 particular areas, and certainly they have the flexibility to go into other areas as well. But very quickly, looking at the professional development for administrators and teachers. Secondly, to look at integrating multicultural education into our curriculum, K-12. Looking at the issue of attracting, hiring, and retaining people of color. We only have about 3% of our adults that represent people of color. And the state average is 6%, and certainly that's a whole nother topic, talking about trying to attract people of color into the field of education when we know that many of them see the pay as being very low and not competitive with other areas. And the fourth, probably the most important of all, is sensitivity training to the adults and students of our community. So I can tell you that the school system, as well over the next few years, during my tenure, will take this issue very, very seriously. And hopefully over the course of time, we can move to an awareness with our faculty, not in the area of trying to push acceptance of religion, but an awareness. We can certainly focus on study of religion and not the practice, and certainly the academics and not a devotion. And so I think it's a very important piece that at least the schools begin to address. And I think over the course of time, if we were to reconvene this particular August group, that maybe when we talk about public schools, especially here in Monroe County, we'll have an entirely different picture than we do today.
Thanks, everybody, for a great dialogue. Thank you. Don't leave without a cookie. Also, there's some materials on the table there that I'll invite you to look at and even to take. They're from a website called freedomforum.org, and it has some wonderful materials from the First Amendment Center on public schools and the teaching of religion. So thank you, and good night.